Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Flávia Romano. I'm the current Bureau of AIIC Brazil. I am the treasurer currently. And we are here to have an interview between Professor Lucas Carlos Lima, who is going to interview Linda Fitchett. Linda Fitchett, and it's a pleasure for us to receive both of you, to have you with us for this very nice and informative conversation, as I think this will be. So just before we get started, I'm going to introduce Linda Fitchett, who was the president of the International Association of Conference Interpreters, AIIC. She was born and educated in England in the University of Leeds and has a conference interpreting diploma in London. She was a practicing conference interpreter for 37 years. She initially worked as a freelance for various international organizations and private businesses in France for 20 years. And then she worked as a staff interpreter of the English Interpretation Service in the European Parliament for 17 years until retirement. She has been an active member of AIIC since 1974 and has participated in many of its varied activities and coordinates its project on interpreters in conflict zones. Marcel?
Okay. I am Marcel de Souza. I am currently the president of APIC, the sister organization of AIIC. We are the Brazilian Association of Conference Interpreters, founded in 1971. And it is a pleasure to have you here, Linda, to share some interesting insights about the world of interpretation. Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Lucas Carlos Lima. Professor Lima is a professor of international law in undergraduate and postgraduate law courses at the Law School of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, the UFMG. He is the coordinator of the International Courts and Tribunals Research Group and the coordinator of the East Asia Studies Center, a think tank with a focus on Asian affairs at the UFMG. Professor Lima is also the director of studies for the Brazilian branch of the International Law Association and deputy editor of the Journal of the UFMG's Law School.
Perhaps Linda could share with us some of her experiences and stories, and then we can engage in the conversation, because she certainly has much more to offer to us in this regard. So, Linda, it's a pleasure to have you showing here in apparently the rooms of the Faculty of Law of Minas Gerais University, and it's a pleasure to meet you more or less personally, and the floor is obviously yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lucas. Let me first of all thank you all, and most particularly the organizing committee of the Nuremberg Trials exhibition, which I hope will be a great success. And thank you, obviously, Professor Lucas, for being here. I hope that we'll be able to have a good conversation. I don't know whether you'll be asking or hopefully answering some of the questions that we can raise today. Let me say that, generally speaking, unfortunately, war and conflict have marked human history, and they sadly still do so today. Linguists, and especially interpreters, are always key players for both sides during conflict and in post-conflict, in peace negotiations, and sometimes in trials like the Nuremberg one. So today I'd like to tell you about our 16 years of activity in the AIIC Interpreters in Conflict Zones project. We sought, and we're still seeking, to protect interpreters in areas of conflict and occasionally in other high-risk situations. And I think certainly our work has raised some questions, both of international and indeed of national law. Our group was created by the AIIC General Assembly in 2009, when we began to hear about the death and injury of interpreters in the two conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The interpreters there were mostly local, untrained people, but they nevertheless did our job. They were often motivated, obviously, by a hope that their situation would improve in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also, of course, they were hoping to make some money in order to survive in those circumstances. And they worked for foreign troops, for journalists, for humanitarian agencies, for embassies, and so on. And that very often took them to dangerous areas where they were risking their lives. And I believe that on entering these conflicts, our governments had a duty of care towards those who they recruited locally to help them. We believe that our governments have got an awful lot to learn from what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, so that any future similar operations can be better managed, at least as far as the treatment of local auxiliary staff and especially the interpreters is concerned. Over the years, as you say, we've gained a lot of information about the working conditions and the fate of the interpreters in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we've tried very hard to influence Western governments and international organizations to get them to protect interpreters working in the field and, of course, to help the interpreters themselves to survive in these conditions. The most dangerous situations usually concern those who work for journalists, for the press, or for the military in conflict areas. Now, the press, the journalists often recruit local people to deal with the local language. They have contacts as well that they can use when on mission. And they're used to working with these people who they call fixers, who we sometimes call interpreters. The military, however, are not so used to working with local civilians. And in these countries, they didn't always recruit the interpreters directly themselves. They used those big, defense contractors such as MEP and things like that. And therefore, the military contracts were often rather rudimentary. The working conditions were not specified at the beginning. They didn't even always include insurance. And so at the beginning, there were interpreters who weren't given body armor. They weren't allowed to protect their faces with masks. They weren't able to obtain medical assistance after they were wounded. And their families might not have been paid compensation in the case of the death of a family member who was an interpreter. There were even, I'm sorry to say, reports of interpreters who were sent first, before the troops, into areas that were suspected of being mined. So in 2012, we, together with our first partners, and I'll mention especially Red Tea, which is a New York-based NGO, and their exclusive mandate is to protect interpreters and translators working in high-risk situations. And we still work very closely with them. So together with them and with FEET, that is the International Federation of Translators, we published just a one-page guide for both interpreters and those using their services in conflict zones. And what we were trying to do is to state more clearly the rights and obligations of both sides to a contract. This field guide wasn't intended only for the military. It contains basic information about good practices and ethics to help both parties work together. And we thought then, and we still think, that if interpreters are seen to be a vital and an efficient part of a team, as we are, then they'll be better perceived, better considered, better protected. I think we weren't wrong, because the military, who were very suspicious of these civilian interpreters at the start, later became their major defenders. And we hope that quite a lot of the military did see our guide. We know that the British contingency saw our guide. It has been translated into many languages, and you can find it, we hope, on the AIIC site. You know, the AIIC interpretation site has been changed, and we're not too sure how easy it is to find documents. If you can't find it on our AIIC site, you'll find it on the Red T site in New York. So I think we need proper labor laws to be applied in all these contracts, detailed working contracts for interpreters who are recruited locally, whether they're recruited directly, say by the military, or by defense contractors. The interpreters must know their rights, and those who use their services must know what their obligations are. Now, as I say, the military was rather badly prepared for these two conflicts because they didn't know very much about local customs. They certainly didn't speak the local languages, and they weren't used to working with civilian interpreters. They didn't, therefore, trust them initially. Trust and friendships were gradually formed, but obviously the military constantly monitored the local interpreters for security reasons. Thousands of local staff were recruited, especially by the armed forces in these two conflicts, although it's very difficult to get hold of facts and figures. Most of our information comes from investigative journalists because no central registry was ever kept about the recruitment, the deaths, or the injury of local interpreters, and often even the national figures about these things are not known. It has been estimated that perhaps more than 50,000 local staff, mostly interpreters, were recruited by the US Armed Forces alone in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. One of the military contractors who supplied interpreters to the US in Iraq reported that at least 360 of their interpreters had died between 2003 and 2008. That was the height of the fighting. And there were more than 1,200 who were injured in that same period. That's quite a lot of interpreters. There was another contractor in Afghanistan this time who reported 30 dead interpreters in 30 months between May 2007 and November 2009. Most of the deaths reported were of interpreters killed on the battlefield, accompanying the troops. But a lot of the other reports could only have been the result of the murder of interpreters by the insurgents because they were seen to be collaborating with the army, with the enemy. Most of the foreign forces did lose at least some of their interpreters, depending on where they were deployed. The British military, we know, lost 21 interpreters in 21 days in Iraq. 17 of them were killed in a mass killing by the insurgents, targeting the interpreters at the end of 2006. The insurgents target interpreters and their families because they consider them to be traitors and spies for the enemy. And that obviously is an expression of the old saying, traduttore traditore, that is the translator traitor mentality. One of the most horrific killings that we heard about before our group was created in 2009 concerned the interpreter or fixer for an Italian journalist who was captured by the Taliban. Now, the journalist was released because there was a prisoner swap. But both his driver and the interpreter were just killed, beheaded by the insurgents. And then after our group has been created in 2009, in 2010, in a very brutal attack, the Taliban killed and decapitated 6 interpreters and cut their tongues out. And a note was pinned to one of the bodies saying that the same fate awaits all those who work for infidels. And one Taliban leader, who is now dead, sent a letter ordering his field commanders to kill or capture civilians working for foreign soldiers and for the Afghan government at the time. That's what the insurgents did then, and that's what the Taliban government is still doing now. Gradually over the years, we joined forces with others. We started, as we said, with Red T, with FIT, the translators. And over the years, an international coalition of support was created, involving linguist associations, but also Amnesty International, PEN International, other bodies like them. And altogether, we wrote a lot of open letters to heads of state, to ministers, to the EU, even to the Pope, calling for the protection of interpreters and translators in conflict zones or in danger for other work that they also do. Now, towards the end of the conflicts, and especially as the drawdown of troops began more or less in 2014 from Afghanistan, it was quite obvious that local interpreters had to be taken out with the troops in order to protect them from reprisals by the insurgents. So we consider that asylum is an absolute imperative in these circumstances. Over the years, we organized or co-organized with our coalition partners meetings in the Council of Europe, in the European Parliament, in the House of Lords in the UK, and 3 times in the UN New York to draw attention to the plight of the interpreters. We do believe that these meetings, our letters and various other activities did give a very firm message to our governments and did encourage them to act, to provide visas, to relocate or provide compensation programs in some way to the interpreters. But all of these programs were so bureaucratic and extremely slow. Even when the USA announced its intention to leave Afghanistan, as you know, President Trump announced this, and then it took a year or so before things started to happen. But countries didn't speed up these programs at all. And that meant that in 2021, in August, with the final withdrawal, we had that terrible situation that everybody saw online, where shamefully so many interpreters and others who'd helped Western organizations and forces were left behind during the final evacuation of the troops. It's said that there were still 20,000 interpreters on the American visa lists. They had a special visa. It was called the Special Immigration Visa to the US for the interpreters. It had first been created in Iraq, where it had worked quite well. But in Afghanistan, it was just so slow that, as I say, 20,000 interpreters and their families still waiting on the lists to get a visa to the USA when the withdrawal took place. And some people have said that only 3% of those who'd applied for these special immigrant visas were taken out at the time of the final withdrawal. Some of the local auxiliary staff which were left behind or taken to camps in the surrounding area have been gradually, slowly evacuated to safety in various countries, but many have had to find their way on their own, very difficult and dangerous trip to Europe, most particularly on foot or by sea. And even there, when they arrive in Europe, it's not sure that they're going to be granted asylum or any other form of protection. Because although people say, oh, the European asylum process is a single process, it's not, because every single country finally has a decision about who they'll protect. We believe that governments have a moral, but also a strategic responsibility towards former local staff. I mean, who in any future conflict is going to be willing to serve our governments, the troops or organizations, if local auxiliary staff in Iraq and Afghanistan are simply abandoned? And many certainly have been. In order to look at international law a bit, let's say that interpreters, we had a study made of the Geneva Conventions many years ago in 2010, where we found that interpreters are hardly mentioned there. And they're only considered to be civilians under the ordinary civilians under the Geneva Conventions, which after all cover the main body of international humanitarian law, the laws of warfare. Now, the European Agency for Asylum, which is the last in multiple agencies that Europe has had, considers that persons who were affiliated with foreign forces, and they make special mention of interpreters, are considered highly likely to qualify for refugee status in host countries, especially concerning refugees or asylum seekers from Afghanistan. The UNHCR as well refers to them as a special category in their guidelines on asylum. But guidelines are not binding. The interpretation also of either civilian or parties to the conflict in the Geneva Conventions is quite concerning for us, because it means that interpreters who very often when they're working for the military are more or less obliged to carry guns or even wear camouflage so that the army they're working for can actually recognize them in the field, they might be considered then to be parties to the conflict and not protected at all. At one of the last meetings we had in the United Nations, we and our Red Tea partner raised this question with the Swiss delegation and the International Committee of the Red Cross. We looked at the question of a possible addition to the Geneva Conventions concerning interpreters, because, you know, there were review procedures of the Geneva Conventions. They said, yes, they were going to try, but of course, we haven't heard anything from them. Well, at least not yet. We believe that our years now of awareness raising are coming to an end. Our group and the International Coalition has done its best to provide information to all sides. Other groups now are also created, many of them in the host countries, to try and help asylum seekers when they arrive. But we've not yet reached our ultimate goal, which was the international recognition of the role of interpreters in conflict areas and the need to protect them. So we might go back to one of our earlier ideas, which was to call for a resolution in the UN, you know, similar to those that were adopted to protect journalists or to protect the Red Cross. UN resolutions are imperfect as a protective tool, because journalists and indeed Red Cross members are still killed. But they are at least a route towards impunity, or the end of impunity. And together with our partners, we did create a public petition to the UN, where we call for the protection of interpreters worldwide, and we included within that draft resolution, within that petition, a draft resolution based on one of the earlier resolutions adopted in the UN for journalists. You can still sign that petition on change.org. We haven't so far been able to actually convince a country to introduce it in the UN, but who knows? We'll perhaps come back to that idea later. So I think that more or less sums up what we did in the past. Most recently, we've been looking more towards the interpreters themselves. Just our group created a document called Tips and Strategies to cope whilst interpreting over the long term in situations of conflict. We produced this document after we'd met with colleagues in Ukraine and with others who worked during the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. And that document does what it suggests. It provides tips and strategies which will help interpreters to protect themselves and to keep mentally strong in situations of risk and conflict everywhere. And in the future, we're hoping to produce a series of videos based on all this work from the past and the documents we've produced. We hope that, videos will perhaps have a wider reach than just documents and can provide some help and information to protect interpreters in areas of risk and conflict. There we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for this fantastic, also sad, but really important speech on the reality that these interpreters are facing. And I can see many issues that we could explore. And I think that the work that you are doing are wonderful because also is a work of law development for protection of a specific category of people that sometimes, perhaps for the big public, are invisible in this conflict. But actually for you that are on the field, that are on the association, it's the everyday reality. And this is something that we talked before, but it's indispensable for any kind of conflict for many reasons, either from guarantee the successes, the objectives of the military, but also to guarantee access to information to the bigger public on what is going on. So perhaps, in a more general way, what would you feel that, with all your experience, is the main difference of the professional interpreters that go to the field and those that work in international organizations? Sometimes they interchange, they are there and then they want to come back. And then, like some journalists, some of them, I suppose, want to go to the field to help to solve the situation. But from your experience, what makes the difference between both and with regard to non-trained interpreters? Because, as you said, a lot of people that are on the field are from that communities participate as interpreters, and then they become more or less protected by the same rules and threatened by the same risks. At least the risks are the same or even bigger sometimes. So what are the main transformations that you see in these people from both sides? Those that are used to a certain level of profession and those that just enter the profession because they are required. What are your personal take on that? Perhaps if you can share some ideas.
Well, obviously, what we would call professional conference interpreters live usually rather a sheltered life. They don't necessarily go to areas where they might, well, sometimes they do, but not very often, go to areas where they're likely to be physically attacked. Whereas obviously those working out in the field, whether it be for the military, for humanitarian organizations, for the press and so on, are indeed in a very difficult and different situation. Now, professional interpreters, I mean, conference interpreters, AIIC members, have all had quite a long training in not only languages, but obviously also in the different methods of interpretation, whether working simultaneously or consecutively. Now, there are very, very few of the interpreters who work in the field who work simultaneously in a little booth with the glass front and the microphone. Most of them obviously work closely together with people, and they're working basically on a sentence by sentence procedure, where somebody will say something and they'll say that immediately afterwards, which is seldom done by a conference interpreter. We might take notes. Sometimes these interpreters in the field will also take notes, but not really very often, and certainly not, you know, if you're out in the field with the military, you're not going to be carrying a pad and a pencil in order to write things down. So it's much more sort of direct form of interpretation. And as I say, practically none of them have gone through any kind of training, not even linguistic training. So we know that in their language knowledge is it's not always perfect, but they do a job, and they get, you know, a message through. Even if it's not perfect, they get a message through to the best of their abilities. Sometimes, you know, we haven't necessarily understood completely what a speaker is saying, and we have to do our best. But I mean, there are many other interpreters, not necessarily working in conflict, but working in courts of law, or you know, in hospitals, who do a slightly different job to us. Which is a kind of an intermediary step between, you know, the professional conference interpreters and then those working out in the field. There's this kind of intermediary people. And in a court of law, sometimes you might be threatened. You know, somebody might be trying to get the, you know, the verdict changed. And so they'll try and get the interpreter to say something they didn't actually say. We did have a case not all that long ago of interpreters being threatened in court in the UK. So there are, you know, things where the two meet, or two or three different kinds of interpretation meet. There are others where they considerably divide. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yes, of course. And what something seems very obvious to you, perhaps to the public of the exposition, what you just said is a huge clarification. And then I come again to the point of one of the phrases that you mentioned, that is perhaps the most literal expression of traduttore traditore, which in that case, exactly, you are not just misleading an information, but you are also involving in the politics of your country, and you have special consequences. So from your experience, what would you say that are the best practices that were developed to improve this reliability? Interpreters, officials, journalists, are there any specific things that can improve the situation and that creates more reliability? I think that one of the very interesting things you said is the fact that they don't have the phrase by phrase, they have to pick context, give the message, they don't have pen. And also this means passing information on what happened or what didn't happen, where is this or that. So from what you've seen, and you have coordinated many groups in this regard, what are the experiences that work, and what would you say that is a practice that should be avoidable avoid with these specific field interpreters?
Mm. Well, I think possibly there's one of the things in our code of ethics which is very important. I mean, in Conference Interpreters Code of Ethics, concerning neutrality. Now, when we're working, we are expected not to show that we have any particular leaning towards one side or another in a conversation. We try to remain neutral. We must remain neutral. We must be seen to be and heard to be neutral. Obviously, in the field, that's not always possible. It's probably possible when you're working with a journalist. It's much more difficult if you're working with the military, and especially in situations like Iraq, Afghanistan. If you are working for a foreign military, which is intervening in your country, it's very likely that somebody is going to consider that you're a traitor. Of course, when our foreign troops went to Iraq and to Afghanistan, there were different governments there. They were governments who had either invited our forces in or, had agreed to have them there. And they are not going to murder these interpreters. It's those who are against the government who are going to murder these interpreters because, they see them as an enemy. I'm not sure that we can change that. After all, I mean, we had World Wars I and II in Europe. And although it wasn't necessarily a question of murdering interpreters, we were not very kind to women, for example, who might have had relations with foreign soldiers, or to, other people who may have been considered to have helped the enemy. So I think that is a kind of inevitable thing. But I do think that we've got to push on this question of neutrality. The interpreter is there to interpret a message between two sides. And I think if we can push that a bit more, we may at least stop them being murdered, even if they're not going to be liked. I mean, you don't necessarily have to murder somebody that you don't like. But in these cases, certainly it was pretty bad, and it still is to some extent. I'm not saying that there are lots of interpreters who unfortunately ended up still in Afghanistan who are being murdered. I'm not saying that there are a lot of them, but there are, and we still hear reports. And certainly some of the Afghans who got out of the country who were interpreters cannot now go back because they're afraid. They're afraid for themselves and for their families. So how do we stop that? I don't know. Maybe you have some suggestions.
No, and now we can enter the one another interesting parts of your speech. That is the question of the protection. And you're clearly unhappy with the protection that we have on the legal field. And I think that you're completely right. I think that there is a new category that appear in this kind of conflicts that people did not consider at the beginning, and now they are putting the umbrella of civilians, and that is enough. But I could see, and these are my words, not your words, some sense of hypocrisy in the sense that these governments say, work for me, but I'm not even going to guarantee that you will be safe after your work is done. But at the same time, your sense of reform, if I understood correctly, it would be have more rules. And from my personal experience, more rules are important for recognition. They are important for the later process to avoid perhaps impunity if you know the guy who killed the interpreter. But these humanitarian rules, they do not always help to avoid the bigger problems there is, the nature of these conflicts. And I understand that there is, I don't know, whole libraries about this tension. But what do you think that would be the ideal outcome? Because sometimes I don't have a specific suggestion, but perhaps when we have a greater aim, we know what we want. So just to give an example, I work a bit in the field of the campaigns against nuclear weapons. I know what the campaigners want. I know what is the maximum goal. And I see the legal strategies that they are using here and there in the conferences and the legal field, people initiating legal actions here and there. What would be, in your view, Linda, the best outcome for guarantee the protection that you feel that is missing? A new conference? A new convention specific? What do you think is the best? Because sometimes we are aiming for, if I understood correctly, some equiparation, some specific legal treatment. Put them here, guarantee the asylum. What will be the best outcome that perhaps this would guarantee the protection that you feel that is missing?
Well, I think there are probably, I don't know about the best, but I think there are several, as I mentioned, there's several sort of things that we want to happen. First of all, as far as, contracting is concerned, we want to make sure that when people contract people to do this kind of work, both sides should know what their rights and what their responsibilities are. We don't want and I hope, I do think that governments have now understood that, if they want interpreters to be working, human interpreters to be working with them in foreign places, they've got to give them, proper contracts where they have insurance, where they have rest breaks on them. That's also quite important. And there is a proper working relationship through a working contract between the two sides. So that's a sort of basic thing, which I think a lot of governments have understood. Then, of course, on the international level, I mentioned obviously the Geneva Conventions, because I'm not a lawyer and I don't know, really what else we might turn to. Maybe you have an idea of something else we might turn to. The Geneva Conventions, as I say, the only place they mention interpreters, the only place, as far as I remember from the study we had first, was that interpreters should be provided for prisoners of war, so that prisoners of war can talk and can be heard. But nowhere else are they mentioned. There's no specific protection for them in the Geneva Conventions. I say we raised the matter in the UN with the ICRC and with the UNHCR. And, they said they were going to look into this, but, who knows how long that might take. And the other question, as I say, was a resolution maybe in the UN, a bit like the protection for journalists or the Red Cross, humanitarian workers. As I say, journalists are still killed, and so are members of the Red Cross. And also at the moment, the very viability, it seems to me, of the UN at the moment is being called into question by certain countries. So, we don't know how strong, their protection would be in the future. So I'd be very happy if you or somebody could come up with, some other, solution. I personally don't know. I think probably some kind of mention in humanitarian law, in the Geneva Conventions, would probably be the best. It won't necessarily stop, interpreters being killed, but at least then, there would be something in the form of redress and an end to impunity.
Yeah, No, I completely agree with you, and I think that when the Geneva Conventions were drafted, there were not such an awareness of the importance and the risks of this profession as a special category. So they considered that being protected under the civilians, that would be enough. And I think that campaigns like yours, expositions, but also this pressure for resolutions, campaigning at the council, going to lobbying every year before the assembly, is a way to raise the awareness. And after this awareness is raised, you can work in many different kinds of legal instruments, from campaigning to general assembly resolutions that don't have an immediate legal effect, but can have a legal effect for interpreting the law. And then you can have a transformation without a real formal new convention, but perhaps you can have courts interpreting and new cases moved here and there that serve as basis to guarantee this kind of protection. But this is a thing that is a long-term strategy, and this kind of event is already part of this strategy of raising awareness of the different situation that interpreters have in the field. And as you said, there are different kind of interpreters in this legal category. So I don't think that they all need the same kinds of response in this regard. But you mentioned something also in your speech, in your talk, that I can see that is changing now in different fields. That is the question of mental health. And mental health is becoming an issue in different kinds of the world. And perhaps you could share a bit of your experience on how these field interpreters react to all the pressure, to all the changing in their life, and what are the initiatives that are in place or that should be in place to help the question of mental health. That is an issue, and we are, at least nowadays, not ignoring it as much as we did in the past. So some words about that.
Well, it's very true that if not all, probably a great majority of the interpreters who were working in circumstances like those in Iraq and Afghanistan suffer, like the troops, with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I know one or two of these interpreters, and certainly I believe that they are suffering from stress, mental stress, most particularly, as well as, of course, as physical wounds in many cases. And it's not always easy. I mean, are those that remained in Afghanistan getting any kind of help with that? I don't think so. And when they get to European countries, okay, we have social security, they can perhaps get health treatment with help from the state, or indeed in the US. I'm not too sure how the health system works for them there. It is true, and certainly in the documents that we produce, the tips and strategies, or will be producing in our videos, we will certainly also be looking at questions of mental health, because when we spoke with our Ukraine colleagues, that was one of the subjects that came up: how to cope with the strain, the stress of being in a conflict, of living daily from one day to the next, not knowing whether you're going to be bombed, whether you're going to be, whether your family is going to be injured. Of course, everybody suffers from that, not only the interpreters, but, those that go to the front lines, like the troops, they certainly suffer. And I think it is something that has got to be looked at. And as you say, we are looking more at this kind of thing nowadays than we ever used to. I mean, nobody ever recognized PTSD in the past. They certainly do now.
And another thing that now is changing, Linda, my impression is that everything is being touched by EA. Artificial intelligence is helping in many ways. This works. And I would like to hear your impressions about how this can change the profession, especially in the field. Do you think that the profession is going to change, will not be needed anymore, depending on the level of technology that we reach? So, what would be your view on that for the future? Because I think that this conversation has been problems that we had in the past, problems in the legislation, and perhaps we are going to have problems in the future. Or perhaps technology can come to help in some way. What would be your impressions with your experience?
I think that's very possible. I mean, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if especially the US military were not trying to develop some kind of AI system which might replace the interpreters in the future. I mean, AI is trying to replace, or it's partially beginning to replace some of our work as conference interpreters. The thing being, however, that although it's making big progress in sort of the major conference languages where there's loads of stuff on the internet that has been plagiarized over the years so that these systems can be built, that's one thing. So, you might not have too much difficulty in gradually over the years improving on interpretation between English and French or English and Spanish or whatever. But it's still lacking very far behind in what we call the exotic languages. I mean, in Afghanistan, Dari, Pashto, are they going to be very good at that in the future or the near future? Maybe, in 10, 20 years. As I say, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Americans, at least, if not other countries, were perhaps trying to develop something. And in a way, I personally would see that as not a bad thing, because instead of interpreters dying, you would be able to, use AI instead of human beings in this kind of conflict situation. Although to some extent, it's terrifying. We might also be getting AI soldiers as well, which, is even more terrifying than human soldiers in a way, although at least then there would be less dying. But no, I do think, I mean, obviously, in our profession, in the conference profession, we're wondering at the minute, what the future will hold. We still think that, we will be needed for many years to come. In the field, you're not necessarily going to be making long speeches. You're going to be, maybe at one level between, the superior officers and things, but in the field, it's going to be perhaps more possible to replace interpreters with AI. I think we have to wait and see. Let's hope that we're not going to have too many conflicts, but unfortunately.
I think that the recent times do not give us that much hope, unfortunately, and I tell that as a professor that has to teach international law 2 times a week. So we're going to the end, Linda, and I agree with you that the ethical questions that these problems raise are enormous, and we have these tensions between what is better, to diminish the profession, but at least people are not dying anymore. What are the risks of this misuse of this technology, because you know when to trust a human being, or you can identify at least some signs what is established in the field for many years of practice. But since we are going to the end, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you and to learn from you from this very interesting cases and also deficiencies of the law that I study. What would be part of our public will be students, legal professions from Latin America, where we don't have exactly the same problems. Perhaps this is the reason why we are not aware of the same necessities. What would be your advice for those that are either entering the profession right now, because we're going to have other students from linguistics of Minas Gerais attending the exposition, but also the everyday person attending the exposition is a law student or a law professor. What message do you think that's the most important to give to these two groups? First, the linguistics. Second, the lawyers. What do you think that it's the most crucial message that you'd like to send us?
Well, I think what basically we've been doing over the last 16 years, awareness. Be aware that this kind of problem exists. If, there are some kind of developments that you think might help, please pursue them. Do get in touch with us if you have great ideas. We are always, and indeed, if you'd just like to help somehow or other, we're always very happy if people can help us in any way to spread the message. Obviously, if you're a language student and you're thinking of going into the interpreting professions, don't forget that some colleagues have more difficulty than other when they're working. Sitting in a booth is quite a protected method of working. Out in the field, it's very different. And I think as law students, help us to somehow move forward and protect interpreters somehow better than we're doing at the moment.
Thank you very much, Linda. For me, it was a great honor and a pleasure to learn from you. I really enjoyed the last hour, so I thank you very much, Flavia and Marcel, for this opportunity. And of course, you already conquered my heart, so anything that you need, you have someone in Brazil to help you in the cause. So really,
perfect.
Yeah, so from ideas to other initiatives, I'm already at your disposition. So I give the floor to the organizers to the final message.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Lucas, for such insightful questions. Linda, for your brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. It's really very enlightening to learn about everything that happens in the world and all the work that you have been doing on behalf of these people. So on behalf of AIIC Brazil, I would like to thank you both very much for being with us. Now I'll give the floor to Marcel.
Linda, thank you so much for sharing such meaningful stories with us. And hopefully the situation will improve and we'll see, we will not see such sad situations happening in the future. Let's just hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to
very
everybody.
much.
Yeah, I hope we'll be able to meet in person at some
I
point.
hope too.
I'd
I hope
love
too.
to come back to Brazil one day.
Let's make it work. Thank you very much, guys. It was really a pleasure. Thank you for involving me in this. Linda,
Thank you.
I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much. I really learned again. I'm insisting in this, but for me it was a wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Splendid.
And have a very nice week.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to you all, and good luck with the exhibition. I really hope you get lots of people interested.
We hope to. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye. Bye-bye.